My name is Daniel Reyes, and I'm 34 years old. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, my mom called and said she didn't want me to come to the family dinner. Not because of the fight, not because of the drama, but because my sister's rich boyfriend wouldn't be comfortable around me. I work a blue-collar job. That's how she put it. Slowly, like it was dirty. Your sister has to make a good impression, she told me. And you don't live up to that image. None of them knew the truth about who I really was. 5 days after Thanksgiving, they showed up at my door unannounced, pale, angry, demanding answers. Because her boyfriend had discovered something that had ruined my sister's perfect life. And a week later, in front of over 400 people, everything they built their lie on collapsed in real time. Before I tell you how my own family went from denial to begging, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you've ever been treated like a family disappointment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, let me go back to the phone call that started it all. The call happened on October 31st, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. And I remember the date because it was the same day my truck broke down outside a loading dock in Patterson, and I had grease on my hands when my phone rang. My mother's name lighting up the screen like it always did right before something uncomfortable. And from the first second I knew this wasn't a casual check-in because she didn't ask how I was or how work was going. She went straight to business and said, "Elias, about Thanksgiving this year," and paused like she was rehearsing a line she didn't want to deliver. Then said, "We think it's best if you don't come." And at first I thought she meant I was late confirming or something stupid like that. So I asked why, genuinely confused, and she sighed and said, "Your sister's boyfriend will be there." Like that explained everything. And when I asked what that had to do with me, she lowered her voice and said, "He comes from a certain world." Then added, "And you don't exactly fit into it." Which was the first time she'd ever said it that directly, not dressed up as concern or advice, just a blunt assessment of my value at the table. Then she said my job made things awkward, that a man who worked warehouse logistics and shipping coordination didn't belong in a room full of people who talked about hedge funds and board seats. And when I reminded her I'd worked 6 days a week for 15 years without asking anyone for help, she said, "This isn't about effort. It's about image." And that word stuck with me, image, because it meant my existence was now a problem to manage, not a son to invite. And when I asked if this was Valeria's idea, she didn't answer directly. She just said, "She needs this relationship to work," which was mom code for yes. This came from my sister, the same sister who got a condo paid for after college while I slept in my truck for 3 months to save money. The same sister who'd never visited me at work, but loved telling people. I was hands-on. And when I asked if Dad knew, she said he agrees it's for the best, which told me everything about where I stood. Then she said, "It's just one dinner." Like erasing me from a family holiday was a minor scheduling issue. And when I told her I understood, she sounded relieved, almost disappointed I didn't argue, because she'd always expected me to swallow things quietly. And after I hung up, I sat there staring at my steering wheel longer than I want to admit, because the truth was I'd been excluded before in smaller ways. Conversations stopping when I walked in, jokes about my boots at formal events, comments about how simple my life was. But this was the first time they'd officially decided I didn't belong. And what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 2 years earlier, after my grandfather Mateo passed away, I'd been named managing trustee of a private family holding account he'd quietly built over 40 years, an account my parents thought had been dissolved, an account my sister believed never existed, an account controlling just over $11 million in assets tied to charitable trusts and investment vehicles that required absolute discretion. And I hadn't told them because Mateo had warned me not to. He'd said, "Let people show you who they are when they think you have nothing." And now, sitting in that broken truck, I realized the test had started. Thanksgiving came and went without a single message from my family. I ate takeout alone and worked a double shift the next morning, and 5 days later, early Saturday, someone knocked on my apartment door hard enough to shake the frame, and when I opened it, my parents were standing there with Valeria behind them, faces tight, eyes wide, not angry like I expected, but scared, because Aaron had discovered something during routine background research for a charity board he was being vetted for, something tied to a trust he recognized, something with my name on it, and they didn't come to apologize. They came demanding explanations, and standing there in my work clothes watching them try to reconcile the version of me they'd erased with the reality they'd just uncovered. I knew this wasn't going to end quietly. Because in a few days there was a public foundation gala in downtown Manhattan, over 400 guests, press invited, and my name was already printed on the program, whether my family liked it or not. I closed the door behind them and realized they weren't there to ask how I was doing or to apologize for cutting me out. They were there because something had slipped out of their control. My father stood stiff in my narrow hallway like he didn't recognize the place. My mother kept looking around as if my apartment confirmed every judgment she'd ever made about me. And Valeria wouldn't meet my eyes at all. She was gripping her phone so tight her knuckles were white. And before anyone even sat down, my dad asked, "What did you tell Aaron?" Not "how are you?" Not "we're sorry." Just that. Like I'd committed some kind of crime. And I told him I hadn't told Aaron anything because I hadn't spoken to Aaron at all, which only made my mom more upset because she'd clearly rehearsed a version of this conversation where I admitted to something she could scold me for. She said, "Then how does he know?" And that was when Valeria finally looked up and snapped, "He ran a background check." Like that. Explained why she'd lied about me for years. She started pacing my living room talking fast, saying Aaron was embarrassed, furious, blindsided, that he'd confronted her about why she'd told him her brother was unstable and unemployed when documents showed my name attached to a trust she didn't even know existed. And that was the first time my mother's voice shook when she asked, "What trust?" Because up until that second she thought this was a misunderstanding she could smooth over, and I told her calmly that Grandpa Mateo hadn't dissolved everything like they assumed, that he'd consolidated assets quietly and named me trustee because I'd been the only one who showed up consistently in his last years. And my dad laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, said, "That's not possible." And I told him it was very possible and very documented. Valeria exploded then, accused me of hiding money, of manipulating Grandpa, of stealing what should have been shared, and I let her talk because I'd learned a long time ago that when people panic they reveal everything. She admitted she'd told Aaron I was unreliable, that I'd never really done anything, that I lived off family pity, and hearing it out loud hurt more than the Thanksgiving ban ever did, because this wasn't something she said to feel superior, it was something she said to erase me completely. And my mother tried to interrupt, saying Valeria hadn't meant it like that, but Valeria doubled down, saying, "I had to protect my future." And that sentence landed heavy in the room because it explained everything. Not just Thanksgiving, but every quiet dismissal before it. And when they demanded I fix it, demanded I explain everything to Aaron so he'd come back, I told them I wasn't going to call anyone, that whatever Aaron discovered, he discovered on his own. And my dad's tone shifted then from demanding to threatening. He said family assets were family business, and that if I didn't cooperate, they'd get lawyers involved, which almost made me laugh because they still thought this was about control, not consequences. And I told them if they wanted answers they should come to the Rivera Foundation Gala on Friday night, that everything would be explained there. My mom asked what gala, and I told her the annual one Grandpa Mateo funded quietly for years, the one with press coverage and donors and board members. And when I mentioned there'd be several hundred guests, my dad's face went pale because he finally understood this wasn't a private conversation anymore. Valeria asked if Aaron would be there, and I told her yes, because his firm partnered with the foundation. And that's when she started crying, not the dramatic kind, but the kind that comes when someone realizes their leverage is gone. She begged me not to humiliate her publicly, said she'd worked her whole life to be taken seriously, and I told her quietly that so had I. I just did it without stepping on anyone else. They left shortly after that, not resolved, not forgiven, just rattled. And as soon as the door closed, my phone started buzzing nonstop with messages from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly asking if everything was okay, which told me Valeria had already started damage control. And that night, I logged into the foundation portal and reviewed the agenda one more time. My name was listed clearly as managing trustee. Keynote speaker scheduled after dinner, video tribute queued, everything in place. And for the first time since that phone call weeks earlier, I felt calm. Because the truth was coming out whether they liked it or not through shouting or revenge, but through receipts, witnesses, and a room full of people who were about to learn exactly who they'd underestimated. The next morning, when my phone started vibrating before my alarm even went off, and I knew without checking that it was family again, because nobody else ever called me that early unless something was wrong, I ignored the first few calls and got ready for work like any other day, pulling on my steel-toe boots and work jacket, Because no matter what chaos was brewing, I still had a job to show up to. And that routine grounded me more than anything else ever had. But by the time I got to my truck, there were already voicemails stacked up from my mom, my aunt, my cousin, even my dad's business partner, who barely knew my name before this week. All asking variations of the same thing. What's going on? What did you do? Why is Valeria panicking? And that told me the story she'd been telling them was unraveling fast. At work, I kept my head down fixing equipment and letting the noise drown out my thoughts. But during my break, I finally listened to the messages, and the pattern was obvious. They weren't worried about me, they were worried about exposure. My mom's voice went from sharp to syrupy in the span of one voicemail, saying, "We just want to talk like adults," then another saying, "You're tearing this family apart," and then another saying, "Please call me before this gets out of hand." I didn't call back. Instead, I opened my email and saw 3 new messages from the foundation's legal team confirming media attendance numbers had doubled since last year, and that several donors had specifically asked whether the Reyes family would be present, which made me exhale slowly because once donors get curious, there's no closing that door. Later that afternoon, Aaron finally called me himself, and I almost didn't answer, but something told me this conversation needed to happen without my family spinning it first. His voice was calm, controlled, the kind of calm people use when they're trying not to sound angry. He said he hoped this wasn't awkward, and I told him it wasn't, and he got straight to the point, saying he'd done routine due diligence because of the partnership, and because Valeria had mentioned family complications, and what he found didn't match anything she'd told him. He said he'd seen my name attached to the Rivera Trust and the foundation filings, and that when he asked Valeria about it, she'd accused him of siding with me. He asked me directly if I'd known about the trust, and I told him yes for years, and that I'd never mentioned it because it wasn't relevant to my life or hers. Until she made it relevant by pretending I was someone I wasn't. There was a long pause, and then he said quietly that the problem wasn't the money, it was the lies, that he could handle secrets but not character. And he asked if I planned to speak publicly at the gala, and I said yes, because transparency mattered more than comfort at this point. He thanked me for being honest, and said he'd be there Friday, and that whatever happened next would be based on what people showed him, not what they claimed. After that call, my phone went silent for a few hours, and I knew Valeria was probably trying to contain the damage privately before the gala blew it open. That evening, my dad showed up alone, without calling first, which was new for him, because he usually sent warnings before conversations. He stood in my doorway looking smaller than I remembered, and said we needed to talk man to man. He tried to frame it like concern, saying he didn't know things had gotten this complicated, and that maybe we could resolve it quietly without embarrassing anyone. And I told him quietly that embarrassment only comes when people pretend the truth is something to hide. He asked me why I hadn't told him about the trust years ago, and I told him because every time I tried to talk about my life, he changed the subject to Valeria's future, and he didn't argue, because he knew it was true. He asked me what I wanted, and I told him respect, not favors, not apologies staged for optics, just respect. He said, "Families don't work that way," and I said then maybe that's why ours keeps breaking. He warned me that Valeria was spiraling, that she'd locked herself in her apartment crying and talking about how unfair this all was, and I said unfair would have been if I'd taken something from her, but all I'd done was exist without lying. He left without another word, and I watched him walk to his car knowing he finally understood he couldn't control the narrative anymore. Later that night, the foundation chair called me personally to say the board had unanimously agreed to move the video tribute to immediately after my speech because of increased relevance, and that press outlets were requesting interviews before and after. I agreed to one short statement and declined the rest because I wasn't trying to build a brand, I was trying to close a chapter. By Thursday, the family group chat that I'd been muted from for years suddenly added me back in and exploded with arguments, accusations, half apologies, and vague threats about lawyers and reputations, and I didn't respond to a single message because Friday was coming, and with it a room full of witnesses who would hear everything clearly without filters. That night, I laid out my suit, not expensive, not flashy, just clean and sharp, and placed the foundation folder beside it. And for the first time since that Thanksgiving call, I slept through the night, knowing that no matter how loud they got, or how much they begged, the truth was already scheduled. And there was nothing left for me to chase or defend. All I had to do now was show up. I woke up before my alarm again, but this time there were no missed calls, no messages, no noise at all, which was somehow worse, because silence meant everyone was waiting. I showered slowly, went through the same motions I always did, but every small thing felt amplified: the sound of water, the clink of my watch, the weight of the folder in my bag. I drove to work for a half shift because I needed the routine one last time before everything changed, and my foreman noticed something was off and asked if I was all right, and I told him, yeah, just family stuff, and he laughed and said family is always the hardest job you'll ever have, and that almost broke me more than anything else had all week. By noon, I clocked out, drove home, and changed into my suit, and stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, not checking how I looked, but reminding myself why I was doing this, because part of me still wanted to back out, still wanted to let Valeria keep her fantasy and let my parents keep pretending they hadn't made a choice. But then I remembered my mom's voice on that call, the way she'd said blue collar like an insult, and the way my dad had stayed silent, and I knew walking away would just teach them that exclusion works if you apply enough pressure. When I arrived at the venue, the parking lot was already full, and the banner with the foundation's name hung over the entrance in gold lettering, catching the light, and for a second I thought about my grandfather, the man everyone thought had left nothing but tools behind, and how he'd be laughing if he could see this moment now. Inside the lobby, donors mingled in tailored suits and evening dresses, and I recognized faces from articles and boardrooms, people who usually didn't look twice at someone like me, and yet here they were smiling, nodding, greeting me by name, because titles change how people see you even when nothing else does. I checked in with the coordinator, and she told me the press area was set up and that attendance had exceeded expectations. Nearly 500 people confirmed, and more still arriving. I asked about seating, and she hesitated before saying your family requested to be seated together near the front, and I told her that was fine because distance wouldn't protect them tonight anyway. Backstage, I met Aaron again, and he looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept well after learning his reality was built on selective truth. He told me Valeria had begged him not to come, not to validate me, and that he'd told her this wasn't about sides, it was about clarity, and she'd cried and accused him of betrayal. He said quietly that whatever happened tonight, he needed to see who she was when she wasn't performing, and I told him that was all any of us ever really need to know about someone. As the ballroom filled, the noise grew into a low hum, and I peeked through the curtain and saw my parents seated stiffly, my mom clutching her purse, my dad staring straight ahead, and Valeria scanning the room like she was still trying to control it. She wore a dress that screamed confidence, but her posture betrayed her, and when her eyes landed on me, her expression shifted from shock to anger to something like fear, and that was when I knew she finally understood this wasn't something she could talk her way out of. The host took the stage, introduced the foundation, spoke about legacy, generosity, impact, and then announced my name, and the applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was respectful and steady, and as I walked out, I felt strangely calm, like once you step into cold water and stop fighting it. I thanked everyone for coming, spoke briefly about the mission and my grandfather's values about dignity and work and contribution, and I kept it simple because I wasn't there to lecture, I was there to establish context. Then I paused and said, before we continue, there's something that needs to be addressed, because tonight isn't just about celebrating success, it's about understanding it. The room quieted, and I could feel the shift, like when a crowd senses a reveal coming. I told them 3 weeks earlier I'd been uninvited from Thanksgiving by my own family because my job would make someone uncomfortable, and there were murmurs and people leaning forward and cameras adjusting focus. I didn't name names yet, I just stated facts, and then said that moment clarified something for me about how easily people confuse worth with image. I explained that the foundation's assets were overseen through a trust, and that conditions existed not to punish but to protect the values my grandfather believed in. And then I nodded to the screen behind me and said my grandfather recorded a message for this moment because he understood that people behave most honestly when they think no one is watching. The video began, and his face filled the screen, older, sharper eyes, still kind, and he spoke calmly about work, respect, humility, and how he'd seen families tear themselves apart chasing status while ignoring character. As he spoke, I watched Valeria sink lower in her seat, my mom's face go pale, my dad finally close his eyes. Then the part came where the conditions were stated clearly: exclusion based on profession or income resulted in forfeiture, and the room reacted audibly, gasps, whispers, disbelief, and the screen shifted to documented messages, screenshots, timestamps, my sister's words, my mother's justification, my father's silence. Valeria stood up shouting that this was unfair, that she didn't mean it, that it was being taken out of context, and security moved closer, but I raised my hand and said let her speak, because context only matters when you're honest. She accused me of jealousy, manipulation, sabotage, and I let her finish before calmly asking her if she'd said what was shown, and she hesitated just long enough for the answer to be obvious. The lawyer stepped forward, confirmed the enforcement of the trust effective immediately, and stated that control transferred to me not as punishment but as fulfillment of intent. And that was when the room truly erupted, voices overlapping, cameras flashing, donors whispering, and my mother breaking down. I took the microphone one last time and said, "This isn't revenge, and it isn't triumph, it's accountability." And then I announced that the assets would be reallocated to programs supporting working families, trades, education, and community investment, because the point was never accumulation, it was stewardship. Applause followed, loud, genuine, not for me, but for the idea, and I stepped back, letting the noise wash over me, knowing that no matter what happened next, the truth was out, and it wasn't mine to carry alone anymore. The fallout didn't wait until the lights dimmed or the guests finished their champagne. It started immediately the second the applause died down and the cameras swung away from the stage, because that's when people stop pretending. My mother was the first to reach me backstage. She pushed past an event assistant like she'd done it 100 times before, eyes wild, voice shaking, asking, "What have you done? What have you done to us?" And I remember noticing how small she looked without the audience, how powerless. My father followed, slower, quieter, his shoulders slumped like something inside him had finally collapsed, and Valeria came last, held back by security, still arguing, still insisting this was a misunderstanding, that lawyers would fix, that money always fixes things. I asked the coordinator to give us a few minutes alone, and when the door closed, the silence was thick and uncomfortable, the kind that forces truth out whether you want it or not. My mother started crying, not the dignified tears she used in public, but messy, desperate ones, saying, "We didn't raise you like this. We never meant to hurt you. It was just one dinner, one night." And I looked at her and said, "It was never about the dinner. It was about the decision and the fact that you didn't even hesitate." My father finally spoke, said, "We were trying to protect the family, protect your sister's future." And I asked him, "Protect it from what exactly?" "From a man who works with his hands, who doesn't fit into photos and cocktail conversations." And that's when he had no answer, because there wasn't one that didn't sound ugly out loud. Valeria snapped back that none of this would have happened if I just told them the truth, if I hadn't hidden things like some kind of trap. And I told her quietly that I didn't hide anything, I just didn't advertise it, because respect that only exists when you're useful isn't respect, it's leverage. She laughed bitterly and said, "You think you're better than us now?" And I said, "No, I think I'm finally equal, and you can't stand that." She tried one last angle, saying Aaron wouldn't have left if I hadn't poisoned him, and I told her Aaron didn't leave because of me. He left because he asked simple questions and didn't like the answers, and because people who are comfortable erasing others usually don't stop at one person. Outside the room, I could hear reporters already speculating, headlines being drafted, narratives forming, and I realized my family wasn't panicking because of what they'd lost emotionally. They were panicking because the world had seen behind the curtain. When we stepped back into the hall, my mother begged me to make a statement to smooth things over, to say it was all a misunderstanding, and I told her I'd already made my statement on stage, and I wasn't taking it back. Valeria stormed off, calling lawyers, threatening lawsuits, screaming that she'd fight this until the end, and the lawyer, who'd been standing nearby, calmly told her she could, but she wouldn't win. Because intent matters, and the documentation was airtight. And that's when something shifted in her expression, not anger, not fear, but realization, the kind that hits when you finally understand the game is over. Aaron didn't say a word during all this, he just watched, and when Valeria finally walked away, he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." And I told him, "We all see things when we're ready, and sometimes the cost of seeing is losing what you thought you had." The rest of the evening passed in fragments, donors thanking me, teachers shaking my hand, people telling me they felt seen for the first time in years, and it was overwhelming but grounding, because it reminded me why this mattered beyond family drama. Later that night, after the venue emptied and the staff began tearing down decorations, I stood alone on the balcony overlooking the city lights, and for the first time since that phone call weeks earlier, I felt something like peace, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was being hidden anymore. My phone buzzed, dozens of messages, some supportive, some furious, some from extended family who suddenly wanted explanations and reconciliations, and I ignored all of them because there would be time later for conversations, but not tonight. That night belonged to closure. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table, still in my suit, and opened the old notebook my grandfather had given me years ago, the one where he'd written thoughts, lessons, reminders, and on the last page in shaky handwriting, he'd written, never beg for a seat at a table that profits from your absence, build a better table, and invite who you want. I slept for the first time in weeks without replaying conversations in my head, and when I woke up the next morning, the world hadn't ended. My job was still there, my hands still rough, my life still mine, but something fundamental had changed because I no longer carried the weight of trying to be enough for people who only valued appearances. The next day, the headlines hit, and they were brutal and precise and impossible to spin, and my mother called again, this time quieter, asking if we could talk, and I told her we could, but not until she was ready to listen, not explain, and she didn't answer right away. Valeria sent a single message that read, "You ruined everything," and I typed back, "No." I stopped lying to protect it and left it at that. Aaron sent one more message thanking me for not humiliating him and for letting the truth speak for itself, and that was the last I heard from him. Work went on. My coworkers asked questions. I answered simply. I showed up, did my job, and noticed something unexpected: respect, not because of money or power, but because I'd stood my ground, and people recognized that even if they don't talk about it. The foundation meetings began quietly, no fanfare, just planning, execution, responsibility, and I insisted the first initiatives support trade workers and overlooked professions because dignity doesn't come from titles, it comes from contribution. My father showed up unannounced one evening weeks later, not angry, not demanding, just tired, and he said, "I didn't know how to be proud of you because I didn't understand your life." And for the first time I believed him and told him understanding starts with curiosity, not control, and that door was still open if he chose to walk through it honestly. Some bridges were damaged, some burned completely, but others were rebuilt differently, stronger, because they weren't based on approval anymore. I learned something through all of this that I wish I'd learned earlier, that being underestimated is painful, but being silent to maintain comfort is worse, and that sometimes the moment you stop shrinking to fit into someone else's picture is the moment they finally see how small their frame really was. The weeks after everything unraveled were quieter on the surface, but heavier underneath, because silence gives people space to think, and thinking is dangerous when you've spent years avoiding it. My family tried different tactics. At first, my mother sent long messages rewriting history, saying she never meant those words the way I heard them, saying stress made her say things she didn't believe, saying a mother's love doesn't always come out right, and I didn't respond because I'd learned that explanations without accountability are just noise. My father took a different approach. He showed up early one morning outside my building, leaning against his car, hands in his pockets like he didn't know what to do with them. And when I asked why he was there, he said, "I didn't know how else to start, so I came here." And we sat in silence for a long time before he finally admitted something I never thought I'd hear. "I was afraid of what people would think if they knew my son lived differently than the image I built," and hearing that hurt. But it also clarified everything, because fear had been the driver, not love, not pride, not concern, just fear dressed up as protection. Valeria disappeared from the family group chats completely, and when she resurfaced, it was through lawyers and public statements and carefully worded posts about betrayal and boundaries and personal attacks that never named me, but always pointed in my direction, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. Because people who pay attention don't need explanations, and people who don't aren't worth the energy. Aaron made one final appearance when he emailed to formally withdraw from any shared ventures with my family, citing irreconcilable differences in values, and that phrase echoed in my head, because values are quiet until tested, and then they're loud enough to end relationships, careers, reputations. The foundation work intensified fast, not because of pressure, but because momentum attracts opportunity, and suddenly people who'd never been invited into rooms were sitting at tables, designing programs, funding apprenticeships, covering medical debt for workers who'd never had a safety net, and every meeting felt grounded, real, because no one was pretending to be someone else. One afternoon, a woman approached me after a site visit. She was a single mother, a welder, who'd received emergency support through one of our first initiatives, and she said, "No one ever looked at me like I mattered before," and that sentence stayed with me longer than any headline, because that was the real inheritance, not money, not control, but the ability to redirect dignity. My mother eventually asked to meet again, neutral ground, no lawyers, no scripts. And when we did, she cried again, but differently, this time quieter, less performative. She said, "I didn't realize how much of my love was conditional until I lost you." And I told her she hadn't lost me, but she had lost the version of me willing to shrink to stay. Close, and she nodded like someone finally understanding a language they'd refused to learn. Valeria never apologized. Not really. She framed everything as mutual harm and misunderstandings and growing pains, and I stopped waiting for clarity from someone who benefits from confusion. Months passed, seasons changed, holidays came and went differently, this time smaller gatherings, chosen family, coworkers, friends, people who didn't ask what I did before asking who I was, and I realized something subtle had shifted inside me. The constant low-level tension of trying to be acceptable had disappeared, and without it life felt lighter, even when it was busy, even when decisions were heavy. My father started volunteering, quietly, no announcements, no photos, just showing up and doing work that didn't come with applause. And one evening, he told me, "I think I spent my life chasing respect from people who never planned to give it and ignored it where it was already offered," and I didn't correct him because some realizations need to land gently. The media cycle moved on as it always does. Scandals fade, new ones replace them. But the impact stayed in conversations. Policies changed, funding redirected, lives altered in ways no article could capture. And sometimes I catch myself thinking about that phone call weeks before Thanksgiving, how small it seemed now compared to everything that followed. And I understood that moments don't announce their importance, they just ask you to respond honestly. I don't hate my family. I don't romanticize what happened either. I see it clearly as a collision between image and integrity finally refusing to bend. If there's one thing I learned, it's that the truth doesn't need volume, it just needs time. And when it finally surfaces, it doesn't ask permission, it simply stands there waiting for everyone else to decide whether they'll face it or walk away. And for the first time in my life, I chose to stand still and let others decide around me. After that, things didn't explode anymore. They unraveled slowly, which in some ways was worse, because explosions end, but unraveling just keeps going thread by thread. The foundation kept expanding, not because we chased growth, but because people who'd been ignored finally saw something built for them, and word travels fast in communities where no one listens. Contractors, mechanics, warehouse supervisors, nurses, sanitation workers, all people my family once called blue-collar, started showing up, not asking for handouts, but offering ideas, offering time, offering trust. And that trust felt heavier than money ever did. I remember one meeting where a guy named Luis sat across from me, hands rough, knuckles scarred, and said nobody ever asked us what we needed before, they just decided for us. And that sentence explained my entire childhood in one breath. My sister tried to regain control in the only way she knew how, by spinning narratives. She went on podcasts about resilience, about cutting toxic family members, about how success makes people targets, and I let her talk, because the truth doesn't compete, it just waits. People started noticing the pattern, the way she never mentioned specifics, never addressed the Thanksgiving call, never explained why her boyfriend walked away, never explained why assets froze, or why donors vanished, and slowly invitations stopped coming. Her circle thinned, not dramatically, just quietly, which is how real consequences usually arrive. My mother called less often. But when she did, the conversations shifted from denial to curiosity. She asked questions she'd never asked before, like, what does your day actually look like? Who do you work with? What do they struggle with? And sometimes I could hear regret in her pauses, like she was realizing she'd missed decades of my life by looking past it instead of into it. My father surprised me most. He stopped defending past decisions and started asking how to fix present ones. He attended meetings without introducing himself, just listening, and afterward he'd say things like, "I didn't know people lived like this," which was both ignorant and honest. And I respected the honesty, even if it came late. The biggest change happened internally, though, because once you stop chasing approval, you start noticing how much energy it used to cost, and how much you suddenly have when it's gone. I slept better, ate better, laughed easier, not because life was perfect, but because it was mine without negotiation. One night after a long day, I sat alone going through old messages, screenshots from that phone call. The words that once felt like knives now read like evidence, not of my worthlessness, but of their fear, and I finally deleted them, not to forget, but because I didn't need proof anymore. Valeria reached out once more through an intermediary, asking for a private conversation, off record, off phones, off witnesses, and I declined, not out of anger, but clarity, because some conversations are traps disguised as closure, and I wasn't interested in stepping back into a room where the rules only benefited one side. Instead, I wrote her a short message saying, "I hope you figure out who you are when no one is watching," and that was the last thing I sent. The holidays came again the following year, And for the first time, there was no dread, no rehearsed explanations, no bracing myself for comments about appearance, income status. We hosted a small dinner at a community center, instead volunteers, families, kids running between tables, mismatched chairs, loud laughter, and someone asked if it bothered me not being with my family. And I said family isn't a location, it's a pattern, and I'm finally in one that fits. Later that night, my father showed up, quietly stood in the doorway unsure, and I nodded him in. He didn't speak much, just helped clean dishes, and before leaving, he said, "I'm trying to learn how to show up without expecting forgiveness." And that might have been the most sincere sentence he'd ever spoken. Success didn't look the way my parents imagined anymore. It didn't live in penthouses or curated feeds. It lived in impact and consistency, in not needing to be louder than the truth to feel seen. If someone had told me a year earlier that being banned from Thanksgiving would be the start of my freedom, I wouldn't have believed them. But that's how it works. Sometimes the door that closes behind you is the one that finally lets you stop knocking. I don't tell this story to prove anything or to win. I tell it because there are people listening right now who've been quietly edited out of their own families because they don't fit the narrative, and I want you to know that being underestimated isn't a curse, it's cover, and what you build while no one's watching often ends up stronger than anything built for applause. I didn't get revenge, I got alignment, and once you have that, the rest falls into place, whether people clap or walk away. The months after that felt quieter on the surface, but underneath everything was still shifting like plates settling after an earthquake. The kind of movement you don't notice until you realize the ground is finally stable. The foundation meetings became less about crisis management and more about long-term planning, which was something I'd never seen modeled growing up, because my family only reacted, they never built. I started visiting job sites, warehouses, union halls, places my sister once joked smelled like failure, and every time I walked in, people didn't ask who I was related to, they asked what I was trying to solve. Those conversations changed me, because for the first time my value wasn't something I had to defend, it was assumed once I showed up and listened. One afternoon, an older woman named Marlene pulled me aside after a meeting and said, "Your parents raised you wrong, but life raised you right." And I laughed harder than I had in years, because it was true in the most uncomfortable way. Meanwhile, the truth about the inheritance stopped being gossip and started becoming boring, which is how you know it's settled. People move on when there's nothing left to extract. My sister tried one last pivot. She rebranded herself online, leaned into a narrative about rebuilding from betrayal, about spiritual growth and healing, but the comments were different now. Less praise, more questions, and questions are dangerous when your story has holes. She called me late one night, voice flat, asking if we could talk, not about money, not about the past, just about us. And I sat with the phone in my hand longer than I want to admit before answering, because part of me still remembered the version of her who used to sneak snacks into my room when our parents weren't looking. But I also remembered the version who threatened to have me removed from my own family dinner, and I realized you don't rebuild bridges by pretending the river wasn't there. So I told her I wasn't ready, and that if we ever talked, it would have to be without rewriting history. And she said she understood, though her silence afterward suggested she didn't. My mother sent a long message a few weeks later, apologizing in pieces, instead of all at once, which felt more honest than any speech she'd ever given. She admitted she'd used comparison as motivation and never noticed how much damage it caused, and I believed her, not because it fixed everything, but because she finally stopped explaining herself. My father started volunteering regularly, no announcements, no photos, just showing up early and leaving late. And one day I caught him teaching a younger guy how to manage a budget without judgment, and I realized people can learn new languages even late in life if they're willing to sound clumsy at first. As for me, I stopped introducing myself with qualifiers, no more just a blue-collar guy or nothing fancy, just work. Instead, I said my name and what I was building, and watched how differently rooms responded when I didn't apologize for existing. The strangest part was how normal happiness felt once it wasn't delayed by approval. Dinners tasted better, conversations felt lighter, and holidays stopped being emotional negotiations and started being just days with food and people. One evening after a long week, I stood on my balcony watching the city lights, thinking about how close I'd been to shrinking myself just to keep access to a table that never had a seat for me anyway, and I felt grateful, not bitter. Grateful that they showed me exactly who they were before I sacrificed myself to belong. If you're still listening and you've been told directly or quietly that your job, your lifestyle, your choices make you less, then let me tell you something from the other side of that story. The moment they stop needing you, small, is the moment you start getting free, and freedom doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels like silence where shame used to live, and once you feel that you won't trade it back for anything, not even family approval dressed up as love. By the time everything settled enough that people stopped whispering my name like it was a scandal and started saying it like it was a fact, I noticed something else had changed too, which was how I carried myself through spaces that used to intimidate me. I didn't rush explanations anymore. I didn't preemptively soften my edges or joke about myself to make others comfortable. I showed up, did the work, and left with my spine straight, which sounds small until you've lived most of your life bent slightly forward, apologizing for taking up room. The foundation expanded quietly on purpose. No galas, no dramatic press, just systems built to last, and people empowered to run them without needing my face attached to every success. That was another lesson I learned. The loudest people in my family always needed credit. The most insecure ones demanded applause, while the people actually doing something meaningful were too busy to notice who was watching. My sister eventually tried to reinsert herself. Through mutual friends' stories about how she was misunderstood, how pressure changed her, how she was still family, and family should forgive. But forgiveness without accountability is just permission, and I wasn't interested in teaching that lesson anymore. One afternoon, I ran into her ex-boyfriend accidentally at a conference, and he looked relieved to see me, which surprised us both. He said he'd felt something was off long before the truth came out, that he ignored it because comfort is seductive, especially when it comes with status, and he thanked me not for exposing anything, but for not playing along, which was the moment I realized the lie they'd built wasn't just hurting me, it was suffocating everyone involved. My phone buzzed less and less as time went on. Fewer emergencies, fewer emotional demands, fewer people needing me to explain myself. And that quiet wasn't loneliness, it was space to choose who I let in and why. I reconnected with people who never asked what I did for a living before asking how I was, people who knew me before the story got interesting and stuck around after it stopped being entertaining. My work deepened. My days felt heavier but fuller, like muscles growing after strain, and every now and then I'd catch myself smiling at nothing, remembering the panic I felt that first phone call and how far away it felt now, like a life that belonged to someone else. My parents still tried. Sometimes old habits die hard, but when they slipped into comparison or nostalgia, I didn't argue. I redirected or ended the conversation, and over time, they learned what behaviors still had access to me and which ones didn't. Boundaries aren't walls, they're filters. And once people realize manipulation no longer gets a response, they either change or drift, and both outcomes are peace. The biggest shift, though, was internal. I stopped measuring myself against their expectations and started measuring alignment. Was I proud of my day? Did my actions match my values? Did I sleep without replaying conversations in my head? And when the answer was yes, everything else felt like background noise. If you've made it this far and you're still carrying the weight of being the family disappointment, the one who didn't follow the script, didn't chase the right titles, didn't marry into the right circle, hear this clearly: your worth doesn't increase when they finally approve. It increases the moment you stop waiting for them to, and the life you build after that will feel quieter, stronger, and more yours than anything they ever offered across a table you were never meant to sit at. What I didn't expect after all of that was how the aftermath would keep unfolding in quieter, more surgical ways, because consequences don't always explode, they often seep. My sister's social circle shrank, first not dramatically, just subtly. Invites stopped coming, texts went unanswered, the kind of silence that tells you people have reclassified you without bothering to announce it. My parents try to frame it as a phase, a misunderstanding, something time would smooth over, but time only smooths things when there's honesty underneath, and there wasn't. I focused on work and structure because structure doesn't lie, it either holds or it collapses, and the systems we were building held up under pressure, which told me we were doing something right. Donors came and went, but the ones who stayed were the ones who asked about impact instead of visibility, who wanted reports instead of photo ops, who understood that dignity isn't scalable unless you protect it from ego. Every few weeks, someone new would learn the backstory and look at me differently, expecting bitterness or a victory lap, and I'd disappoint them by being calm, because the truth is, once you stop needing validation, revenge loses its flavor. The hardest moments were still family holidays, not because I missed the table, but because I missed the version of myself who kept hoping it would change if I tried harder, spoke softer, dressed better, and let that version go. Felt like mourning someone who never really existed, my sister. Eventually sent a long message full of language she'd clearly borrowed from therapy accounts, online accountability, growth healing, but there was no apology, just explanation, and explanation without responsibility is still deflection, so I didn't respond right away. I let it sit until the urgency burned off, and what remained was clarity. When I did reply, it was short, honest, and final. I told her I wished her well, but I wasn't interested in rebuilding anything that required me to shrink first, and that boundary landed harder than any confrontation ever had because it didn't invite debate. I noticed something else. Two people who had watched quietly during the worst moments started reaching out, not to gossip, but to say they'd seen it happen, that it had changed how they handled their own families, their own silence, their own tolerance for disrespect, and that mattered more than any public reckoning because it meant the story didn't end with me. My parents oscillated between remorse and resentment, which told me they were still negotiating with their self-image instead of reality, and I learned to stop participating in that negotiation because you can't argue someone into accountability. They have to arrive there on their own. The days became more ordinary in the best way possible: meetings, emails, routines, dinners that didn't come with emotional landmines, and slowly the narrative stopped being about what was taken from me and started being about what I was building. There was one moment late one night when I locked up the office and realized I hadn't thought about Thanksgiving or the gala or the inheritance all day, and that's when I knew the shift was real, because peace doesn't announce itself, it just shows up and stays. If you're waiting for a moment where everything clicks and suddenly hurts less, know this: it's not a moment, it's a series of choices made consistently until the old story loses relevance and the new one stops needing justification. I didn't win anything, I simply stopped losing myself. And that turned out to be enough to change everything, even when no one was watching. What people never talk about is the quiet phase after everything blows up, the part where there are no witnesses left and no adrenaline to carry you forward, just long days where you have to live with the consequences of choosing yourself. And that phase was harder than the confrontation because there was no clear enemy anymore, just habits and memories and old reflexes trying to pull me back into a role I'd already outgrown. I kept working because work was honest. Pallets got moved, contracts got signed, drivers showed up or they didn't. There was no pretending in logistics, no way to fake results, and I liked that. It grounded me in something real while my family kept floating between guilt and denial. My mother started calling more often, not to apologize but to check the temperature, to see how open I might be to pretending things were normal again. She'd ask about my schedule, my health, whether I was seeing anyone, always circling but never landing on the one sentence that mattered. My father stayed quieter, which in his case meant more, because silence had always been his way of avoiding responsibility, and I recognized it instantly. They wanted reconciliation without reckoning, peace without truth, and I understood then that the distance between us wasn't created by the inheritance or the boyfriend or the dinner invitation. It had been there for years. This was just the first time I refused to cross it alone. Meanwhile, the foundation kept growing in ways that surprised even me. Teachers from states I'd never visited sent emails explaining how a small grant changed their classrooms, how they no longer had to choose between groceries and supplies, how someone finally treated their work like it mattered. Those messages hit harder than anything my family ever said because they were rooted in impact, not image. I realized my grandmother hadn't just left money behind. She'd left a test. And it wasn't for my sister or my parents. It was for me, to see whether I'd use it to prove something or to protect something. I chose protection, of dignity, of people who never had a seat at the table to begin with. And once that choice was made, the noise around me started to fade. My sister tried again a few months later, this time through a handwritten letter, softer language, fewer justifications, more vulnerability. She wrote about losing friends, about how fast status evaporates when you're no longer useful, about how humiliating it felt to be on the other side of judgment. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because I was looking for ownership, for a sentence that said I was wrong without an explanation attached, and it wasn't there. There was pain, real pain, but it was still centered on her loss, not her choices, and I finally accepted that empathy doesn't require access. I could feel for her without reopening the door. I didn't respond right away, and when I did, it was measured, kind but firm. I told her I hoped she found stability and purpose, but I wasn't ready to rebuild anything until there was accountability, not performative growth, but actual understanding of why what she did was wrong. I didn't argue, didn't lecture, didn't threaten. I just stated the boundary and let it stand, and that felt like real strength for the first time. The strangest part was how my own identity shifted once I stopped trying to be legible to them. I dressed the same, worked the same hours, drove the same truck, but internally something loosened, like I'd been holding my breath for years without realizing it. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, stopped wondering how to explain myself, stopped preemptively defending my choices. When people asked what I did, I answered plainly. When they asked about my family, I answered selectively, not out of shame, but out of respect for my own peace. I learned that privacy isn't secrecy, it's discernment. There was a moment at a small industry conference when someone recognized my name from a panel I'd done and started asking questions about the foundation, and I watched their tone shift when they realized I wasn't interested in branding or publicity. They wanted a headline, I wanted sustainability, and that mismatch told me everything. The people who stayed in the conversation were the ones who cared about systems, not spotlights, and those were the people worth building with. Slowly, a new network formed around me, not based on blood or obligation, but on shared values and mutual respect, and it felt sturdier than anything I'd grown up with. My parents eventually asked to meet, neutral ground, a quiet cafe, no audience. I agreed because I wanted closure, not reconciliation, and there's a difference. My mother cried. My father spoke carefully, like every word was a negotiation. They said they hadn't meant to hurt me, that they were trying to protect my sister's future, that they never imagined it would spiral the way it did. I listened without interrupting, then I told them something they weren't expecting. I said the pain wasn't about Thanksgiving or the boyfriend or the money. It was about a lifetime of being managed instead of known, minimized instead of understood. I told them I didn't need them to agree with my choices, but I did need them to respect them, and that respect wasn't optional anymore. They nodded, said they understood, but I could see in their faces that they understood the consequences more than the cause. Still, it was enough for me to stand up and leave without anger, because closure doesn't require consensus, it requires clarity. After that meeting, I stopped checking my phone so often. The constant vigilance faded. I slept better. I laughed more easily. The foundation announced a new initiative focused on vocational workers, people like me who kept things moving quietly, and the response was overwhelming. It felt like honoring a version of myself I'd been taught to hide. Sometimes I thought about how different everything would have been if my family had simply accepted me as I was. But that thought no longer carried bitterness, just curiosity. Different doesn't always mean better, and loss doesn't always mean failure. I understood then that some families don't break, they reveal, and once revealed you have a choice: keep pretending or start living honestly. I chose honesty, even when it cost me proximity. Because proximity without respect is just another form of isolation. The story people saw from the outside was about money and power and a dramatic reversal. But the real story was quieter, about a man who stopped trying to earn a place he already deserved and built something that didn't require permission. And that part, the part no one applauded, was the part that finally made me feel whole. The final thing I learned, the part that doesn't trend or fit into a headline, is that revenge isn't loud when it's done right. It's quiet, structural, and permanent. And by the time people realize what changed, they're already standing in a world where their old rules no longer apply. I didn't cut anyone off dramatically. I didn't gloat. I didn't post receipts online or give interviews tearing my family apart. I just stopped absorbing their shame and redirected everything they dismissed into something that actually mattered. That's what broke them, not anger but irrelevance. My sister tried one last time months later, a phone call late at night, voice softer than I'd ever heard it, asking if we could start over, not apologizing outright, but hinting at regret, at loneliness, at how different things felt now that the admiration was gone. I listened, because listening costs nothing, but when she said she missed how things used to be, I finally understood we were talking about two different pasts. She missed the version of me who stayed small so she could feel big. I missed nothing about that life. I told her I wished her peace, but I wasn't interested in shrinking again, not for family, not for nostalgia, not for guilt. She cried, and I let her, because growth hurts, especially when it's late. The foundation crossed a threshold that year, not just in funding, but in credibility. Lawmakers started calling, unions reached out, educators asked for input on policy, And for the first time in my life, people weren't asking who I knew. They were asking what I thought. That shift felt surreal at first, then grounding, because it was based on consistency, not performance. I stayed where I was, same job, same routine, same truck, because the work kept me honest, and I never wanted to become the kind of person who forgot where value actually comes from. I watched from a distance as my parents recalibrated their social circles, quieter dinners, fewer invitations, the slow realization that status isn't inherited, it's borrowed, and it can be revoked without notice. They didn't ask for money, not once, and I respected them for that, even if respect came late. On the anniversary of my grandmother's death, I visited her grave alone. No speeches, no flowers big enough to photograph, just quiet and time, and I told her everything she'd never needed to hear because she already knew. I told her the test worked, that people showed exactly who they were when they thought kindness was optional, and that her faith and patience had paid off. Standing there, I felt something close to gratitude for the exclusion that started all of this, because without it, I might still be negotiating my worth instead of living it. The irony is that my family wanted to protect an image, and in doing so they revealed a truth that set me free. I didn't win because I had leverage. I won because I stopped needing approval. The money was never the point, control was. And once control shifts internally, no one can take it back. If you're listening to this and you've ever been sidelined, minimized, or told you don't fit the picture someone else is trying to sell, understand this. Their picture is fragile. Your life is not. Build something that doesn't require them to clap. Choose work that reflects your values. Surround yourself with people who don't need you to perform to belong. My family learned too late that respect isn't about proximity to power. It's about proximity to truth. And the truth has a way of surfacing whether people are ready or not. I didn't destroy anyone. I simply stepped out of the role they assigned me and let the structure collapse on its own. That's the kind of ending that doesn't fade, because it isn't an ending at all. It's a reset. And if there's one thing I'd leave you with, it's this: being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below, and don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.